Hi, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in today's video I am taking a stab at some fine furniture in the form of an entryway table. And at times it was a lot of fun, but let's just say mistakes were made, so keep watching to see how this thing comes together. I'm building this table for some friends of mine, and they said they like darker, richer colors, so I headed down to the local hardwood store to pick up some walnut. It was love at first sight when I spotted this beefy 8/4 board that weighed about as much as my car. I had them do an initial surfacing of the shop, and the guy that was helping me out took one look at me and said, "Alright, little man, do you need me to take this out to the car for you?" And I gladly accepted. While she was a very attractive and full-figured specimen, there were a couple blemishes that needed to be addressed. No deal breakers here, just a couple of voids that I needed to fill with some epoxy after scraping out as much of the rotted wood that I could with a chisel. I just used some epoxy that I found on Amazon for pretty cheap, and it definitely got the job done, but if I had one gripe here, it took forever to cure. The bottle said it was 12 to 24 hours, but it was at least 72 hours until it was hard enough to where I couldn't gouge the surface with my fingernail. I overfilled the voids just slightly since I knew I was going to be planing down these boards a fair bit, and I didn't want to have to do multiple pours. Next, I needed to start breaking down this board into workable pieces, and I began by cutting down one straight edge with a track saw. I probably say this in every video, but a track saw is worth every penny, and the 9-foot track is also worth its absurd price tag, I have to say. The core elements of this build were really driven by the future owners of this table, and they said they were looking for something that would have a few drawers and potentially some shelving for books. But since it was going to be towards the entryway of the house, they asked if I had any ideas to make it interesting, and this is where I gave them my Vanishing Cabinets pitch.
I see that it had a certain panache. That's what I'm good at, not the work, not the work. The presentation.
I don't have a jointer wide enough for this board. It has a slight twist in it. To flatten this face, I'm going to use a piece of melamine, and then I'm going to add some shims. Kind of keep this board from wobbling as it gets through the planer. So I'm just going to put one here. And I'm just adding one to the opposite corner as well. Alright, no wobble on this guy. This handy trick to flatten a wider board in a planer using a sled and shims is extremely useful. And the reason you can't just run a twisted board through the planer on its own is because the planer will be surfacing the face up side relative to the underside face. And so if the underside has a twist, oftentimes it will just create a thinner board with the same twist. And there are a lot of great videos out there on how to flatten boards, and I'm always flabbergasted at how other creators are able to innovate when tools are limited. But at the very least, I can vouch that this method works pretty well. And this side we still have a little bit of a wobble. Do the same for the other two. Look at that. The final milling step after getting the boards flattened was to square them up on my table saw, referencing the straight edge that I initially cut with my track saw. The quote-unquote creative design feature I was going to add to this table to give it some panache was to take this big, beautiful piece of walnut and create 2 waterfall edges so the grain would continue all the way around the table, and that will basically create a shell surrounding some cabinetry with drawers and shelves. But the real showpiece is going to be the big piece of walnut in all of its continuous grain glory. To create the waterfall edges, I'm using my track saw once again to cut 45-degree wedges from each edge of the joining boards, and I'm cutting it as close to the edge of the 90-degree straight cuts I made earlier. That way I can preserve the continuous look of the top-facing side. After quickly adding a 20-degree bevel to the front-facing edge of the boards just to give it a more interesting profile, I got to work drilling out some mortise holes for the dominoes that I'm going to be using for the joinery. Festool, who makes this tool, is renowned for its precision, and this would have worked great if only the boards were actually cut at 45 degrees. The f***? It's way off. Uh-oh. As it turns out, the angle gauge on my track saw is a couple degrees off, so I'm now using my miter saw for attempt number 2. Why does it do that? I don't know what the deal is, but with the miter saw tilted the way I have it, but it leaves this pretty good sized gap, creates this kind of wavy cut. I don't know what that is. Very frustrating. I'm going to use this angle as a reference for the track saw and recut it on the track saw. I ended up doing some research after getting that wavy cut, and I think I was getting some blade deflection on my miter saw. And question for the audience here, what is the best way to avoid or at least reduce that in your experience? Alright, it's go time. Said a quick prayer. Let's do this thing. I basically spent a full day cutting and recutting the 45-degree cuts on the edges to get them as straight as possible, but in all honesty, I still didn't think they were perfect, flat 45-degree faces. But at a certain point, I just had to progress the project and live with the outcome, and so now I'm embarking on what I considered to be the most nerve-wracking part of the build, and that is the glue-up for the waterfall edges. The dominoes were going to be doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of lining up the boards, so for me the real challenge was trying to figure out the best way to clamp up the joints. The best I could come up with was first cutting down a couple of 2x6 boards to act as spacers that I would stack in between the bottoms of the legs, essentially creating a complete rectangle, and then I would get the table clamped square using some strap clamps around the whole thing. And finally, I would add some parallel clamps just to add some additional pressure along all of the edges. At least for now, it seemed to work out pretty decent. I'm noticing now that this didn't glue up totally square. It's kind of slanted this way. Maybe a ½ inch all the way down to the bottom. If it was the table just on its own like this, I don't think it would be a huge issue. But since I'm going to put cabinets under here that are going to be built square, it's not quite going to fit. My one hope is that I build the cabinets completely square and then I'm going to essentially force them to fit with some screws. I don't know if that's going to work, but let's hope that works. All in all, with the table being slightly slanted as well as some minor gaps and cracks in the joints, I'd give this glue up about a B or maybe even a B+. My college GPA was right at about 3.0, so at least I can say I'm consistent. I had heard from a lot of other woodworkers, and it's been absolutely true in my experience as well, and that is that there will always be mistakes in projects. But there are also many ways to fix and hide those mistakes. And so for me, the real progression hasn't necessarily been getting better at building stuff, but it's really been getting better at masking mistakes and imperfections. Yes, of course it would be nice if all the joints and everything came together nice and clean and I didn't have to do a lot of cleanup work. But for now, I just have to accept that this stuff is really hard and there will always be mistakes. Or at least that's what I'm currently deluding myself into thinking so I don't get too discouraged. But I digress. Back to the build here. I finished the waterfall edge portion of the build and now I got to work on the cabinetry. There are going to be 2 cabinet sections, one with shelves and one with drawers. And the future owners mentioned that they were looking for a ubiquitous color for the whole piece, and since I already had the walnut theme going, I picked up an 8x4 sheet of 3/4 inch MDF with a walnut veneer, and that is going to be what I'm using for the shelving as well as the drawer fronts. These hardwood sheet goods are nice to work with because they're really flat, and of course you can get some wide planks out of it, which is harder to find and a lot more expensive with solid wood boards, not to mention a lot more work getting them milled up. I would say the main drawback is that any exposed edges will show that ugly MDF core, so you just have to make sure to cover that up with trim or edge banding. And just also keep in mind the veneer is really thin, so you have to be careful working with it because there's not much opportunity to sand it down. I built the shelving cabinet out of the walnut MDF and the drawer cabinet out of some cheaper birch, since none of the faces will be exposed and it'll be purely structural. And I assembled these using dado grooves to align the panels and brad nails and glue just to hold everything together. Oh god, I love that vacuum. After getting the cabinet boxes screwed together, I got to work on the face frame. Sorry if those video effects were distracting. I was getting pretty restless here in the edit booth and couldn't help myself. But all I really did there was cut down some walnut strips that I was going to be using for this face frame. And I'm using the domino again for the joinery, and I marked out on all the boards where to cut the mortises so the frame would be laid out and lined up to the cabinets I just finished building. Using the accessories coupled with reference marks, I have a pretty tedious system here to make sure everything lines up. Surely with all this technology and tedium, nothing could possibly go wrong.
Nothing can possibly go wrong. Possibly go wrong. That's the first thing that's ever gone wrong.
What? What's going on here? What's happening? What the hell, dude? No, this is wrong. This is wrong. At some point when I was making the reference marks, I got turned around and made some marks on the underside of the boards, and the mortises didn't end up lining up. But eventually I drilled more holes in the right spots, and I was able to orient the boards so that the incorrect holes won't be visible, luckily. After getting the frame attached with pocket holes, I did notice the joint cabinets were slightly out of level. I think from the way the cabinets dried, but in any case, I just removed some material with an electric hand plane and we were all good to go. For this table, I was really shooting for something high-end, and I didn't want to skimp out on the drawers, so to class up the drawer boxes, I attempted to make dovetail joints for my first time. And all I can say about this is I have a newfound respect for the guys that are dovetail experts. There's a really great Ukrainian woodworking channel called Grinwood that has a video I tried to follow on making these. The video was actually really simple and easy to follow. The issue is that there was still a lot of micro adjustments that I had to make to create the spacers to get the dovetails to line up. Now, of course, there are a lot of different ways to make dovetails and jigs and all kinds of other resources out there. This is just the approach I took. And I will say I like how they did come out. But in the future, I'd probably try a different way of doing it just to get some more experience and see which one I like better. Actually, on second thought, I'm never trying these again. Alright, a couple of things. So I only cut 3 into this side because the way I'm pushing it through the router, it's leaving this rounded over edge here. And I didn't want that visible on these outsides. This side has those 3 that are in the lock in there and these little nubs. I'm going to cut these little nubs off on the table saw, but this dovetail shape only goes in so far, it doesn't go all the way to the back. So I also need to make this side a little bit thinner. The last of many steps for these drawer parts was to route out some grooves for the drawer bottoms with a 1/4 inch straight bit. For the outward facing side, I didn't want the groove to be visible, so I plunged the board in just past the edge and then pulled the board off the router right before the back edge. My material choice for these drawer boxes was maple, since that's pretty much the cheapest hardwood at my local place. Plus, I think it looks really great. And speaking of costs, this is as good a time as any to talk about the overall cost for the project. As far as lumber, I spent $515, with the large board being about $350 just on its own. For the hardware and other miscellaneous items bought specifically for this, that was another $90. And then as far as costs for lumber and consumables that I already had on hand but didn't end up using them all, so things like finish and plywood, screws, nails, all that kind of stuff, I would estimate that to be another $100. So that is going to bring the total cost to around $700. And I will say, for the way this thing turned out, that is a very reasonable cost. With the drawers all done, I got to mounting the slides in the cabinet, and the main trick here was just cutting down some spacers out of 2x4s to allow the slide to be clear of the face frame. I also use a Craig drawer slide mounting jig, which really helps to keep the slides level when screwing them in. I do recognize that these drawers look like they belong in a miniature Barbie dream house, but the reality is that this piece is meant to sit in an entryway, so storage isn't really the main priority. There is a bit of form over substance going on here, but I still think these will work for some small essential items like batteries, flashlights, flasks, and so on. I am using the same walnut veneered MDF for the drawer fronts that I used for the shelving, and also in the same way that I used the cabinet face frame to cover the edges of the MDF for the shelving, I'm using some iron-on walnut edge banding to cover up the edges of the drawer fronts. This process is pretty easy. I just ironed on the banding, cut off the excess overhang, and then some super light sanding to soften up the edges. I got pretty ambitious with these drawer fronts in that I wanted all the gaps around the edges to be somewhere between 1/16 of an inch and 3/32 of an inch. I think the smaller gaps give it a more professional look, but with these smaller gaps comes a dramatically lower margin for error. I thought I had a pretty good system going here where I was using spacers to initially stage the fronts in place, and then I clamped that position while I drove in some screws. Let's hope this one fits. Oh, it's freaking tight as shit, dude. The trickiest one was this last one because I wouldn't be able to fit clamps in there, so I ended up using super glue to hold that one in place. With all the fronts mounted, I went ahead and attached these concealed drawer pulls along the top edges. And then I had the brilliant idea of taking off the fronts to add some wood glue and brad nails to reinforce the fronts of the drawers.
Oh shit. How did that happen? How was that possible? What? Dude, how? No. Holy moly. That's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
That was a mere 6 seconds of a 4-hour-long war of drilling, re-drilling, clipping nails, scraping glue, all to get these drawer fronts lined up the same way I had them initially. But my resolve did win the battle, and with those on, I went ahead and added some cabinet lighting in the shelf area. I used the overhangs of the face frames and the space behind the drawers to hide all the wiring here.
This crap again.
It turns out that there would be a second world war with the drawer front Axis powers and myself. Apparently when I screwed the cabinets into the waterfall section, the cabinet got slightly warped from its original position, so I had to go back, pry them off, scrape the glue, and remount them all over again. Although there had been a lot of rework up to this point, the end was very close now, and the last bit was to get the walnut veneered back sheet on and then wipe everything down with a tack cloth to remove all the dust prior to finish. It is time now to take your daily meditation break and enjoy gratuitous shots of some Rubio Monaco and some black walnut.
Gorgeous. I love how those drawers came together.
We can't afford this.
Well, that is pretty much all she wrote on this build, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Probably one of the nicest pieces I've ever made, but of course this girl was always destined to be with somebody else, and so I had to let her go. But thank you all for watching, and I will see you on the next one.
Alright, here she is.
Wow. That was awesome.
That looks really good. Oh, these are nice.
Yeah. Yeah, this looks
Thank
great.
you. This looks really, really good. I love it. Yeah.